Welcome to our journey through one of the most terrible incidents in Appalachian history. Today, we'll go into a story the textbooks preferred to forget. A tale too horrific to be taught in schools regarding a woman whose reputation teetered between sainthood and something considerably more horrible. Let us know where you're watching from, because this drama will cover mountains, valleys, and the darkest reaches of 19th century North Carolina. It was mid-1863 when the Civil War was still tearing the United States apart, leaving severe scars in every area of the country. In the Appalachian Mountains, especially in western North Carolina, the fighting had created a power vacuum and a sense of abandonment that entered the bones of remote villages. The roads were unstable, hardly more than muddy paths that meandered between trees and pines that had stood for decades. The wind howling through the rocky canyons was the only sound in the thick fog that covered the valleys in the morning. Into this barren scene arose Sarah Denton, a 41-year-old woman who had acquired a strange reputation among the mountain people. She presented herself as an independent missionary, someone who gave spiritual solace and material support to those most in need. At the time, it was uncommon for a woman to travel alone like Sarah did. Her visage was described in surviving records as severe, with penetrating eyes that seemed to probe the soul of everybody who came into contact with her. She always wore grim, almost feral attire and carried a tattered leather luggage. The earliest accounts of Sarah Denton occur in the Haywood County archives in a mountainous area close to the Tennessee border. She arrived during the terrible winter of 1862, when many families experienced hunger and misery induced by the war. Husbands and adult sons had gone out to battle, leaving wives and old people in charge of vast farms. Sarah gave prayers, small bits of food she took with her, and most crucially promises of better days through faith and penance. Yet there was something about the manner Sarah performed. Her efforts that disturbed some locals. Whether Methodist, Baptist, or Presbyterian, she never belonged to any recognized church. She preached in deserted barns, remote clearings, or even within the houses where she was accepted. Witnesses from the era recounted bizarre rituals, hours-long prayers, and severe fasts she enforced on both herself and those seeking her spiritual counsel. The local newspaper, the Westville Mountain Herald, published a small mention in March of 1863 about a devout woman who roams our mountains, providing compassion to the distressed. The note was positive, almost reverential, yet it finished with a fascinating observation, albeit her approaches are odd by accepted norms. This seemingly harmless comment carried layers of meaning that would only be disclosed months later, when the first disappearances began to be linked to Sarah's presence in the communities. During the spring of that year, 3 persons disappeared without a trace in several communities in the mountainous area. First was Margaret Holley, a 57-year-old widow who lived alone in a cottage near the Pigeon River. Neighbors said that Sarah had spent several days staying with Margaret, undergoing what she called an intensive spiritual retreat. 2 weeks later, when other locals went to see Margaret, they discovered the house was vacant, the door blowing open in the wind, and the owner was nowhere to be seen. All her stuff were there, including a tiny sum of cash stashed under the mattress. On the upper slopes close to the town of Marshall in Madison County, the second disappearance took place. Living on a property bequeathed from his parents was 62-year-old Thomas Garrett, who had lost his legs in a gangrene outbreak years prior. He was noted for his intentional seclusion and a certain hatred toward life. Sarah emerged, offering specific spiritual care for individuals carrying unseen burdens of the soul. Thomas accepted her companionship. 3 weeks later, when a nephew flew from Tennessee to visit him, he found the house locked from the inside, but completely unoccupied. Thomas had simply vanished. Even more unsettling was the third case. Elizabeth Crane, 49, was regarded as a midwife and traditional healer in the Hot Springs area. Given that they both provided services that were on the verge of spirituality, she and Sarah had a sort of covert rivalry. Locals recalled a tense argument between the two women on the porch of the general store, where Sarah apparently stated something about pathways that cross only once. Elizabeth disappeared one June night, leaving behind her bag of medical instruments and herbs, things she would never willingly forsake. This sinister tale taking place in the foggy Appalachian Mountains is just getting started. 3 individuals went missing, a missionary with no church, and an entire region began to mutter things no one dared ask aloud. What was Sarah Denton really doing on her extended spiritual retreats? Why did the folks who received her most intense attention tend to dissipate like smoke? And most unsettlingly, why did the local authorities appear so hesitant to look into a woman who spoke of redemption and carried a Bible? The following months brought an aura of suspicion that hovered over the mountain settlements like a constant fog in the lowlands. Sarah Denton resumed her wandering tour, appearing in ever more distant villages, always carrying that leather suitcase and her black-bound Bible. The fact that she appeared to predict people's needs made it much more unsettling. Arriving exactly when someone was suffering times of acute vulnerability. In the summer of 1863, Sarah set up a makeshift camp in Buncombe County, close to the city of Asheville. She placed a tiny canvas tent in a spot off the main road where she welcomed guests seeking spiritual counsel. Towering chestnut trees around the location, blocking sunlight even at midday, resulting in a persistent darkness that some people found uncomfortable. The sound of the nearby creek drowned out. Chats, making it hard for anyone close to hear what was going during Sarah's sessions with her followers. It was at this period that the story of Abigail Morton arose, a 38-year-old lady newly widowed after her husband was killed in an ambush by deserting Confederate soldiers. Abigail was distraught not just by the death, but also by her precarious financial circumstances. The farm was mortgaged, the crops had failed, and she had no close relatives to help her. When Sarah Denton showed up, providing naught, Abigail recognized a lifeline in promises of heavenly sustenance through material detachment as well as spiritual consolation. Witnesses stated that Abigail began spending entire days at Sarah's camp, returning home only to care for the animals and then returning for prayer sessions. Her attitude clearly shifted. The previously talkative woman grew silent and withdrawn. When neighbors attempted to speak with her, they were met with blank stares and monosyllabic responses. Prudence Walker, a woman who resided on the nearby land, later described to the sheriff that Abigail seemed to be strolling in a horrible dream from which she could not awaken. The last time Abigail Morton was seen alive was on an August afternoon as she headed toward Sarah's tent carrying a bundle of garments. She informed Prudence she was going on a spiritual purifying retreat that would last many days. When a week passed without news, Prudence encouraged her husband to travel to the clearing. They discovered the place absolutely abandoned. They had taken down the tent. Abigail had just vanished, and there was no sign of Sarah Denton. The woman's property was found locked, the animals lowing in the corral with hunger, and no hint as to her location. The Buncombe County Sheriff, a man called Josiah Reynolds, ultimately concluded the disappearances could no longer be overlooked. He was a veteran of the Mexican War, accustomed to harsh situations. However, he acknowledged in private correspondence that he was quite uneasy about Sarah Denton's case. How could he investigate? A woman who didn't seem to have done any evident crimes. She didn't steal. She didn't threaten. She didn't coerce anyone into doing anything. People would simply disappear after spending extended time in her company. Reynolds began gathering statements and following Sarah's movements around the counties. What he discovered created a worrying pattern. Sarah frequently targeted widows or widowers with some property or modest savings, as well as lonely people without close family ties. She stayed for weeks or perhaps months, developing trust, delivering genuine spiritual comfort at first before gradually intensifying prayer sessions and periods of fasting. Witnesses noted how the victim seemed to enter a condition of utter obedience, obeying Sarah as if she were a figure of unquestioned divine power. Reynolds was particularly troubled by the total lack of bodies or any proof of foul play. There were no things that suggested a struggle or resistance, no strange stains, and no indications of violence. People simply ceased to exist as if they had entered a different dimension. The vanished people's properties remained undamaged, their money remained where it was, and their land ownership paperwork remained in the same places. Sarah seemed uninterested in clear material gain, which made her reasons all the more opaque and dangerous. During his inquiries, Reynolds discovered something that threw new light on Sarah Denton's past. She had first appeared in the Appalachian region in 1858, possibly from Kentucky. But before that, a mist of contradictory news and unverified rumors obscured her path. According to some, she was married to a Methodist minister who passed away inexplicably. Others claimed that she had been exiled from a distant religious community for doing prohibited rituals. Some even claimed that Sarah was not her real name, but an alias she assumed following some horrific experience in her adolescence. In September 1863, the Asheville Spectator published a careful piece headlined, "Concerns about Itinerant Missionary," while listing the disappearances and posing unsettling queries regarding the coincidence of all being connected to the same individual, the article refrained from making direct accusations. In the mountain settlements, the publication created a sensation. Sarah was fervently defended by some, who said that she had provided real solace during difficult times. Others began locking their doors when they heard reports that the missionary was nearing their areas. The only way Sarah Denton could respond to the mounting accusations was to vanish. In late September, woman simply vanished from the North Carolina mountains. No one saw her go. No one knew where she had gone. She left behind a trail of unanswered riddles and families ripped apart by uncertainty. Dead or alive, the missing were never located. Their properties were subsequently taken for debt or occupied by distant relatives. In the mountains, life went on, but Sarah's shadow lingered as a somber reminder that not all outward goodness originates from a pure place. Early in 1863, winter arrived, producing blizzards that isolated several Appalachian settlements for weeks at a time. Because it was practically impossible to travel between counties when the roads became rivers of frozen muck, Sheriff Reynolds' investigations cooled along with the weather, not because he lacked motivation. It was during this period of enforced silence that the first rumors appeared from nearby Tennessee, alleging that Sarah Denton had simply crossed the mountains and continued her activities in new territory. When circumstances allowed, traders who traveled between Knoxville and Asheville heard rumors. They heard about a missionary woman who had arisen in the secluded regions of eastern Tennessee near the Smoky Mountains, delivering the same spiritual services that Sarah gave in North Carolina. The description fit well. A middle-aged woman who preached non-denominational sermons, always wore black clothing, carried a leather luggage and a Bible, and had an unsettling talent for spotting weak individuals. Reynolds tried to maintain connection with Tennessee authorities, but the continuing war made any coordination between states extremely impossible. If letters reached their destination at all, it took weeks for them to do so. The telegraph system, which may have facilitated communication, was reserved primarily for military matters. The sheriff found himself in a frustrating predicament. He was aware that there was a serious problem, but he lacked the authority or means to take action outside the boundaries of his own county. In the meantime, in the icy mountains of East Tennessee, a fresh series of events began to unravel. Sarah had made her temporary home close to the town of Cosby, in an area renowned for its dispersed farms and thick forests. Cockey County was much more secluded than the locations where she had previously operated. Families lived separated by miles of tortuous pathways. Due to resources being allocated to the war effort, government presence was virtually non-existent, and the legislation was inconsistent. It was there that Sarah found her next victim, a guy named Nathaniel Porter. He was 46 years old and had been injured during the war, making it impossible for him to work the fields as he previously had. Living alone in a cabin that his parents had given him, Nathaniel farmed just enough to make ends meet. He was well known in the community for being troubled by his combat experiences and frequently waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of screams reverberating through the valley. His nearest neighbors, who lived over 2 miles distant, had learned to ignore these alarming sounds. Sarah appeared at Nathaniel's door one November afternoon, giving specific prayers for those troubled by images of death and devastation. She claimed to have methods of spiritual purification that might release the soul from the atrocities she had encountered. Nathaniel, yearning for any type of respite from his nightly torments, received her graciously. Later, witnesses reported seeing them together a few times at the village general store, where Sarah bought food with money that mysteriously never seemed to run out despite her having no obvious work. The pattern was repeated. Nathaniel began to isolate himself even more, denying visits from the few acquaintances who occasionally visited. He was seen wandering the paths alongside Sarah, his head always down, moving as if in a daze. A woman called Martha Blevins, who was going through the region selling fabrics, described a disturbing encounter. When she arrived at Nathaniel's cabin to present her goods, she discovered Sarah motionless in a chair on the porch, while Nathaniel was inside reciting prayers in a... Martha was unable to recognize either English or any of the dialects she was familiar with. In December of that year, as the first heavy snows buried the mountains, Nathaniel Porter disappeared. His cabin was found empty by a distant cousin who had traveled from Virginia to visit him. The house was in order, the firewood stacked, the supplies stocked, but no trace of Nathaniel or Sarah Denton. The cousin was drawn to one specific detail. There were odd patterns on the wooden floor in the middle of the main room, drawn with what appeared to be charcoal ash. These were symbols that didn't correspond to any known religious tradition. Circles interlaced with intersecting lines generating fascinating geometric shapes. Reynolds of North Carolina was more committed than William Hodges, the local sheriff. He reported the disappearance but didn't initiate a thorough inquiry. The conflict was still devouring resources and attention, and a lone man missing in the mountains wasn't deemed a priority. Hodges thought Nathaniel had just moved on, looking for a new beginning away from the painful memories. As for the symbols on the ground, he deemed them the product of a mind perturbed by the war, nothing more. But Sarah wasn't finished in Tennessee. She traveled farther into the state during the winter, following the frozen rivers and valleys to even more isolated areas. In January of 1864, she appeared in Sevier County near Gatlinburg. There was a village so small it didn't even have an official name on maps. She came upon 2 old sisters who shared a farm that had been inherited. Clara and Judith Ramsey were 63 and 65, respectively, never married and noted for their gracious hospitality despite their low circumstances. Sarah spent weeks staying with the Ramsey sisters. Neighbors visiting the farm noticed progressive changes in the 2 women's behavior. They went from being talkative and upbeat to becoming quiet and aloof. The weekly sewing meetings they typically organized were terminated without explanation. The local. A messenger informed the church that the sisters had discovered a more direct spiritual path under Sarah's direction, and would no longer be attending services. Elijah Thornton, the church's pastor, was worried enough to pay an unexpected visit to the Ramsey farm in February. He was extremely troubled by what he discovered. The sisters were considerably emaciated with dark circles under their eyes and lethargic motions. The house, once immaculately tidy, was in disorder. At the door, Sarah greeted the Reverend and, respectfully but firmly, refused him access, saying the nuns were on an intensive spiritual retreat and must not be disturbed. Thornton insisted on speaking to Clara and Judith, but they came momentarily at the window, gestured that all was well, and vanished back into the house. 2 weeks later, when Reverend Thornton returned with 2 church deacons, they found the farm completely abandoned. The Ramsey sisters were gone, Sarah Denton was missing, and the home was locked from the outside. As they pushed their way inside, they found that all of the sisters' possessions were still there, including family jewelry kept in a wooden box that any burglar would have stolen. The kitchen bore marks of recent meals, but no evidence of a struggle or violence. It seemed as if the 3 women had simply vanished into the icy mountain air. Reverend Thornton went to Sheriff Hodges requesting an investigation, but again faced resistance. Hodges maintained that adult women had the right to come and leave as they wanted, and that the sisters had presumably elected to follow Sarah on her travels as a missionary. There was no one, no evident offense, and no need for a search. Thornton persisted, but bureaucracy and indifference prevailed. The case was presented as a voluntary disappearance, and life continued on in the dark mountains. We are seeing a frightening pattern that is becoming more and more obvious. Sarah Denton traveled like a shadow across the mountains, leaving voids where people formerly stood. What did she truly do to those who trusted her? How could she make individuals suddenly disappear without a trace? And why did the authorities seem so helpless or unwilling to stop her? The finds made by a Thor in the Highlands in the spring of 1864 would ultimately compel authorities to give Sarah Denton considerable consideration. A hunter named Jacob Whitmore was following deer tracks in the deep woods along the French Broad River on the border between and Sevier counties when he stumbled upon something that would drastically shift the direction of the investigation. Beneath the layers of twigs and decaying leaves, in a deep valley far from any recognized track, he uncovered personal possessions that had definitely been purposefully discarded. There were women's clothing, a Bible with the name Clara, Ramsey written on the inside cover, property documents belonging to Nathaniel Porter, a leather suitcase identical to the description several witnesses had given of Sarah Denton's luggage, and other personal items that were later identified as belonging to various missing persons. A black, leather-bound notebook full of notes was the most unsettling, written in a tight, slanted hand. Lists of names, dates, descriptions of properties, and sums of money were scattered throughout the pages along with odd symbols and sections from prayers that seemed to be warped interpretations of biblical verses. When Jacob Whitmore brought everything straight to Sheriff Hodges, he was unable to disregard the evidence this time. He summoned North Carolina, Sheriff Reynolds, and delegates from neighboring counties where disappearances had been reported. For the first time, authorities began connecting the dots, crossing state lines, and recognized they were dealing with something much wider and more sinister than isolated examples of people merely changing addresses. Sarah's notebook was thoroughly scrutinized by various persons, including Reverend Thornton, who had formal education and could read the complicated writing. What he uncovered within the stained yellowed pages was a precise record of systematic psychological manipulation. Sarah noticed her victims' psychological qualities, their special vulnerabilities, profound anxieties, and secret desires. She recorded the effects of each prayer session, the most effective fasting and sleep deprivation methods, and the exact moment at which each person attained what she called a condition of absolute receptivity. The allusions to a location Sarah referred to as the sanctuary of final metamorphosis were even more unsettling. When the chosen ones were ready, had fully discarded their old identities, and were ready to step beyond the veil, she wrote of bringing them to this place. The notes were purposefully ambiguous about the specific site of this refuge, but they held clues to a cave deep in the mountains, accessible only by routes Sarah had carefully traced over the years. Based on the hints in the notebook, authorities planned search missions. For weeks, parties of armed men roamed the most isolated sections of the Smoky Mountains, researching known caverns and exploring rock formations that might conceal secret entrances. The task was huge. The mountains had thousands of caves, many never previously catalogued, and the dense foliage made it impossible to cover the entire terrain systematically. In addition, there were very few resources, and the Civil War was still ongoing. It was a local guide named Samuel Creek, a guy of Cherokee ancestry, who knew the mountains like few others, who eventually found something noteworthy. In May of that year, he uncovered a cave concealed behind a seasonal waterfall high in the mountains, in an area so steep and treacherous that only few would travel there. The entrance was narrow, concealed by thick undergrowth and only discernible from specific perspectives. Signs of recent passage caught Samuel's attention. Branches purposefully broken to show the way, rocks shifted to facilitate the climb. Unmistakable signs that someone utilized this path routinely. Samuel was followed to the cave by Sheriff Hodges, Reynolds, and a party of 6 armed men. They took lights and lamps, ropes, and provisions for an investigation that may last days. The entry led to a natural tunnel that sank at a sharp inclination. The walls, wet and slick, the air getting thicker and colder with each step. The sound of trickling water echoed strangely, and everyone felt an increasing oppression as they moved deeper into the mountain. After nearly an hour of careful descent, the tunnel opened onto a large cavern. What they found within chilled even the most seasoned men. The cave had been converted into a sort of macabre temple. The walls were covered in the identical symbols found in Nathaniel Porter's hut, drawn in ash and what appeared to be animal grease. Candles were set in concentric circles, though they had been unlit long enough to acquire layers of dust. A naturally occurring rock structure had been altered to function as a kind of altar in the middle of the room, with books piled high and personal items thoughtfully placed. But there were no bodies, no human remains, no marks of physical assault, no evidence of the end destiny of the people Sarah had brought to this area. It was precisely this absence that made everything even more unsettling. The men looked everywhere in the chamber and investigated adjacent tunnels that branched out in different directions. They uncovered more symbols, more candles, more personal belongings belonging to the missing, but no conclusive explanation as to what had happened to them. Reynolds found something that made him pause in the center of the cave, clutching his flashlight with shaky hands. It was a mound of nicely folded garments, each inscribed with stitched initials. He recognized some as belonging to people who had disappeared in North Carolina months prior. The clothing was spotless and meticulously arranged, as though its owners had chosen to take it off and leave it there as part of a custom. Alongside the garments were farewell messages written in different scripts, all following a similar pattern. Declarations of renunciation of the material world, statements of thanks to Sarah for showing them the right way, and assurances that they would ultimately find peace through transformation. The men spent 2 days investigating the cave, complex, tracing tunnels, and recording everything they found. They discovered smaller chambers that Sarah presumably used as forced meditation locations, spaces so tight a person could barely sit, where she likely kept her victims in sensory isolation for protracted periods. There were scratch marks on the rock walls, proof of despair and attempts to escape. However, religious inscriptions were also handwritten into the smoother surfaces, indicating that acceptance eventually replaced opposition. The Reverend Thornton, who had persisted on accompanying the expedition despite his senior age, spent hours poring over the writing on the walls. He decided that Sarah had formed her own deeply twisted religion, merging elements of conventional Christianity with extreme interpretations of purification by suffering and transcendence through the annihilation of the ego. She believed, or at least persuaded others to believe, that she was presenting a path to a higher form of existence that required the utter renunciation of earthly identity. But the question that tormented everyone went unanswered. Where were the people? If they didn't perish in the cave, where did they go? The tunnels were investigated as far as was technically feasible, but many of them ended in solid rock walls or were too small for humans to travel through. There was no visible way out or way to go somewhere else. It was as if Sarah's victims had physically vanished from the face of the earth after passing through that subterranean haven, the discovery of the cave. Turned Sarah Denton's case into an obsession for the authorities involved. Particularly, Sheriff Reynolds appeared to be at a loss for ideas. He remained next to the cave's entrance for weeks, supervising explorations that got deeper and more desperate. Mining engineers were called in to analyze the geological structure, expecting to uncover hidden chambers or passages that the earlier explorers had overlooked. But the mountains guarded their secrets with tenacious persistence throughout this time. Following extensive investigation, tales of Sarah's sightings began to appear in increasingly isolated locales. A woman matching her description was apparently observed in Knoxville in late May, buying passage on a stagecoach headed south. Another witness claimed to have seen her in June in a Methodist church in Chattanooga, sitting by herself in the back pew and observing the speech with that piercing gaze that so many had spoken of. A Nashville businessman described an odd exchange with a traveling missionary who discussed delivering spiritual solace to the distressed in rural Georgia. Reynolds sent letters to sheriffs throughout the American South warning of Sarah Denton and providing precise descriptions, but communication was slow and unreliable during the closing months of the Civil War. Many letters never reached their destination. Others were overlooked by officials who had more serious concerns, including injured soldiers returning home. The economy's collapse and the social fabric's overall disintegration due to protracted hostilities. Herbert Blackwood, the courteous attorney for one of the impacted families, started his own independent investigation during this tumultuous time. Blackwood represented the distant heirs of Margaret Holloway, Sarah's first known victim in North Carolina. While attempting to settle property and inheritance disputes, he discovered that he was unable to simply pronounce Margaret dead without some hard proof of her demise. This caused him to investigate the case's specifics in a manner that authorities, overpowered by several obligations, couldn't. Blackwood was meticulous and patient. He personally traveled to each area where Sarah had operated, interviewed with scores of witnesses, collected every scrap of information possible, and began to develop a psychological profile of the woman. What he learned through his private inquiries was both fascinating and scary. Sarah Denton was not simply a common criminal or even a typical killer. She was something more complex and deeply disturbing. A skilled manipulator who had converted human frailty into a macabre art form. Through talks with persons who had known Sarah but managed to avoid her influence, Blackwood recognized her strategy. First, she recognized isolated persons enduring significant existential crises, recent grief, war trauma, terrible loneliness, chronic illnesses that hampered their ability to function. She first provided sincere consolation, fostering trust with modest deeds of kindness and individualized care that these individuals rarely received from others. Gradually, Sarah inserted aspects of her warped theology. She advocated that true peace could only be attained by the total disintegration of the ego, and that earthly pain was an illusion brought about by attachment to material identity. She combined hours-long prayer sessions with continuous fasting to weaken her victims' mental defenses, repeating mantras until they reached altered states of consciousness. Social isolation was key, she persuaded her. Victims become completely dependent on her presence and advice, withdrawing from friends and family. Blackwood found something extremely alarming through a witness who had temporarily fallen under Sarah's control, but managed to flee before it was too late. A woman called Rebecca Summers, who lived in Madison County, said that Sarah had began to speak about a special area where chosen people could experience a final transformation. She defined this process as a symbolic death followed by a spiritual rebirth where the individual would emerge as a pure being, liberated from all the responsibilities of worldly existence, having entirely abandoned their previous identity. Rebecca described how Sarah spoke about this procedure with incredible hypnotic certainty. According to her, individuals who experienced the metamorphosis experienced such deep serenity that they were no longer required to return to the world they had left behind. To others who were still confined to the tangible world, they merely carried on in a different plane of life. Rebecca admitted. Because for weeks she sincerely believed these statements and was eager to follow Sarah to that magical location. The magic was only broken, and she was brought back to reality by the unexpected visit of a cousin. Blackwood created a theory based on this data and offered it to the Tennessee authorities as well as Sheriff Reynolds. He concluded that Sarah had not killed her victims in the conventional sense. Instead, she had led them to a mental state where they gladly agreed to death by tactics Sarah characterized as spiritual transcendence. Perhaps excessive fasting to the point of famine. Maybe protracted rites in chilly caverns exposed participants to the elements. Maybe even more covert techniques that didn't leave any visible signs of assault. Blackwood's explanation would explain why there were no traces of struggle or resistance. Why the victims seemed to collaborate willingly till the end, and why there were no remains in the caves. Sarah simply discarded them in remote mountain locations where they would never be found, or left them in deep, inaccessible sections of the cave complex that had not been accessible to explorers. It was clear from the well-folded clothing and parting notes that the victims genuinely thought they were taking part in something holy, and were unaware that they were headed for their own demise. The Civil War ended in April 1865, and with it came a realignment of government priorities. Resources that had previously been impossible to get began to be dedicated toward resolving accumulated civic concerns. Sarah Denton's case finally gained official attention at the federal level. Government authorities were dispatched to coordinate operations across states and attempt to locate the woman who was now formally wanted on various offenses. During this time, a promising lead surfaced, despite the fact that the precise nature of her offenses remained unknown. In July 1865, a telegraph operator in Atlanta, Georgia, reported having an odd chat with a missionary woman. She had asked for directions to Alabama and Mississippi, battle-devastated territories where entire communities had been decimated, and survivors wandered in shock and desolation. The telegraph operator, who had read about Sarah Denton in the newspapers that were finally beginning to circulate freely with the conclusion of the conflict, was under the opinion that this woman met the description. Reynolds quickly headed off for Georgia, but by the time he reached Atlanta, any trace of Sarah had gone cold. She had left once again, likely traveling for the most ravaged districts of the Deep South, where the post-war chaos produced optimal conditions for her procedures. Thousands of people were relocated, families had been torn apart, and government documents were in disarray or altogether lost. For someone like Sarah Denton to work covertly, it would be the perfect setting. During the fall of that year, reports began to arrive from various parts of Alabama and Mississippi. Mysterious disappearances of elderly persons who had lost everything in the war, traumatized soldiers, and war widows. The patterns seemed strangely familiar. Increasing social, solitude, connection with a traveling missionary, protracted sessions of prayer and fasting, and finally, complete departure without a trace. However, it was impossible to verify that it was indeed Sarah Denton. It might be her, or it might be other people using the mayhem. It might just be a horrible coincidence of dire circumstances. Attorney Blackwood released a thorough brochure in November 1865 warning communities throughout the South about the perils of receiving help from itinerant missionaries unaffiliated with founded churches. He explained Sarah Denton's modus operandi in precise detail, hoping the information might prevent future victims. The pamphlet was reproduced in newspapers across various states and distributed to churches, general stores, and post offices. It was the first time that information on a criminal case had been circulated so far throughout the southern United States. The pamphlet received an unexpected and unsettling response. Dozens of people wrote to Blackwood reporting interactions with ladies that fit Sarah's description or demonstrated comparable conduct. Some reports came from as far away as Louisiana and Arkansas. A pattern evolved from the letters. Communities still rebuilding from the war, remote, rural places, and vulnerable victims without robust family support systems are all constant. Sarah, or those using similar tactics, appeared to be proliferating throughout the devastated South like an unseen plague. The winter of 1865 to 1866 provided a necessary break in the research, but also an unforeseen development that would provide new light on Sarah Denton's origins. After reading Blackwood's brochure, Amos Caldwell, a Presbyterian minister serving a congregation in rural Bourbon County, Kentucky, promptly wrote a thorough response to the attorney. What Caldwell disclosed in that correspondence was both fascinating and terribly troubling. Caldwell had known Sarah Denton, or at least the lady he assumed to be her, for nearly a decade. In 1856, a female, named Sarah Blackwell, had arrived in his neighborhood as the wife of an itinerant missionary named Josiah Blackwell. With their fervent lectures on salvation and redemption, the couple attracted scores of believers to their revival gatherings in barns and open fields. They appeared to be committed and pious. Caldwell, young and newly ordained at the time, had collaborated occasionally with them, impressed by Josiah's eloquence and Sarah's evident dedication. But something changed suddenly in the summer of that year. Josiah Blackwell fell dangerously ill during an especially harsh heat wave. His symptoms were odd: growing weakness, mental bewilderment, and sometimes seizures. The local doctor could not determine the particular cause and attributed the ailment to severe heat paired with tiredness from hard missionary activity. Sarah cared for her husband with seemingly unshakable love, refusing help from other members of the community, maintaining that she alone could give the required care via prayer and natural cures. She prepared herself. Josiah Blackwell died after 3 weeks of grief. He was buried in a modest churchyard with a basic ceremony. Sarah lingered in the town for a few weeks following her husband's death, evidently sad and lost. The couple's little possessions were left behind when she abruptly left one September morning. At the time, Caldwell assumed the widow had sought comfort from relatives in another state and didn't give it any thought. But now, nearly 10 years later, reading the detailed. Caldwell started to doubt all he had seen after reading the details in Blackwood's leaflet. He remembered minor events that at the time were inconsequential, but now took on terrible meaning. Sarah usually prepared Josiah's meals separately from her own, claiming he had particular dietary limitations. She possessed an arsenal of medicines and tinctures that she jealously guarded, never allowing anybody to touch. During Josiah's illness, she had adamantly refused to allow the doctor to investigate the treatments she had, catered to her husband, claiming they were sacred recipes passed down through generations of healers in her family. Even more unsettling, Caldwell recalled that Sarah had inherited an unexpected sum of money following Josiah's passing. A few weeks before to his illness, Josiah had casually stated that a distant uncle had died and left a small estate. It appears that Sarah utilized this money to pay for her departure from the neighborhood, but there were also reports that Josiah had ownership, paperwork for Tennessee land that belonged to his family. These documents were never found after his death. Blackwood was elated by this information. He personally traveled to Kentucky in the spring of 1866 to examine further. In Bourbon, he managed to locate church papers verifying Josiah Blackwell's marriage and death. He also found the doctor who had treated Josiah, a now old man named Dr. Marcus Hale. Hale confessed he had always suspected Josiah's death, but at the time he didn't have enough evidence to charge. Anybody who has something. Hale said that Josiah's symptoms were compatible with poisoning from specific plants that grew abundantly in the region, namely water hemlock and foxglove. Given in small, frequent dosages, coupled with other medicines to disguise the bitter taste, these medications might induce exactly the clinical picture Josiah depicted. But proving poisoning without a post-mortem examination was impossible, and at that time, no one had cause to suspect a presumably loving woman caring for her dying husband. Blackwood managed to discover some distant Blackwell family relatives still residing in Kentucky. They established that Josiah had inherited land in Tennessee and possessed ownership certificates worth a large sum. These documents were never transferred or recorded following his death. They just vanished. The family assumed they had been lost or destroyed during Sarah's sorrow. Now, it became evident that she had taken them and possibly sold the land using falsified papers. Armed with this fresh knowledge, Blackwood began searching for previous records of Sarah's life. Sarah Blackwell, he learned, was probably also an assumed name. A woman matching her description had married Josiah using paperwork that listed her background as Virginia. But when Blackwood attempted to trace her relatives in that state, he found no birth or family records matching the surname she had provided. It was as if Sarah Denton, or Sarah Blackwell, or whatever her real name was, had appeared out of nowhere, an entity with no traceable past. Blackwood's results revealed that Sarah's actions in the Appalachian Mountains were not the beginning of her criminal career, but possibly just a more perfected phase of something she had been doing for much longer. Before developing the more complex system of spiritual manipulation she created during the Civil War years, she had begun with individual targets, husbands or partners she could control through intimate ties. Sheriff Reynolds persisted while Blackwood discovered Sarah's history in Kentucky, trying to track her down in the present. He had grown virtually fanatical in his hunt, abandoning other official tasks to explore every lead, no matter how tenuous. Concerned, his wife wrote to the county sheriff in the area pleading with someone to persuade Reynolds to take a nap and let others handle the inquiry. But Reynolds was seized with the urge to identify Sarah and bring her to justice, not only for the known victims, but for the countless thousands he thought were in areas where no one had yet connected there. Disappearances to the mysterious missionary. During the spring of 1866, Reynolds followed a lead to Mississippi, where tales of a mysterious missionary had appeared in a decimated town near Vicksburg. When he got there, he found that 3 individuals who fit the typical profile of Sarah's victims had vanished in recent weeks. But when he attempted to gather comprehensive physical descriptions of the missionary, he received conflicting reports. She was reported by some witnesses as being older than 40. Others swore she appeared younger. Her hair was described as gray by some. Others insisted it was dark brown. This offered a scary idea Reynolds hadn't considered previously. What would happen if multiple people used the same techniques? What if Sarah Denton had imparted her skills to others, establishing a sort of manipulative network that extended throughout the devastated South? Or possibly she simply disguised her appearance skillfully enough that witnesses gave varied descriptions. Wigs were easy to obtain. Simple cosmetics could add or remove. Visible years, and a person's appearance and mannerisms had a significant impact on how others saw them. The situation was growing increasingly convoluted and frustrating. Each hint appeared to lead to a dozen more unresolved questions. Each discovery about Sarah's past revealed new layers of lies and manipulation. And although investigators like Reynolds and Blackwood committed time and energy to unraveling the mystery, new victims continued to disappear in rural villages across the southern United States. Sarah Denton was previously charged with several counts of fraud, manipulation, and probable murder by a grand jury in Haywood County, North Carolina, in June of 1866. This was the first time official criminal charges had been brought, converting the matter from an informal investigation into a formal legal manhunt. Posters describing Sarah were created and delivered to sheriff's offices across 16 states. The reward offered for information leading to her apprehension was $500, a large figure that caught the interest of expert bounty hunters. However, Sarah Denton consistently appeared to be ahead of the game. There would be no verified sightings for months. Then, suddenly many reports would come from different regions almost simultaneously, making it impossible to discern which was true. She had become like a ghost, a whispered presence in the stories of isolated villages, a name people uttered in hushed tones when discussing the mysterious mysteries affecting their communities. Reverend Thornton, who had followed the investigation from the beginning, wrote in a sermon preserved in his church's archives, "We are confronted not just with a female criminal, but with the manifestation of something deeper and darker in human nature." Sarah Denton represents the capacity we all have to use the faith, hope, and despair of others as tools of manipulation. She is a dark mirror reflecting what we can become when we entirely renounce compassion and embrace control over the defenseless as our sole aim. We're reaching the point where Sarah Denton's case becomes more than just the tale of a single criminal, an investigation into how human predators routinely take advantage of social structures' flaws, particularly in times of crisis and change. And the question that plagued all those concerned persisted. Was Sarah Denton still out there, operating under a new name in a new city, wreaking havoc on lives without realizing the threat that had come to its door? The autumn of 1866 delivered a discovery that would fundamentally affect the path of the investigation. In October, Blackwood received an urgent telegram from a sheriff in northern Alabama's Lawrence County. The topic was brief but explosive. A woman matching Sarah Denton's description had been detained attempting to steal property records from the local clerk's office. She was being jailed pending questioning and probable extradition to North Carolina. Reynolds promptly headed off for Alabama. With an almost desperate sense of haste, they traveled day and night. Thomas Briggs, the local sheriff, was waiting for him with troubling news when he eventually arrived at Moulton, the county seat. Although the arrested woman was undoubtedly acting suspiciously, there were increasing questions about whether or not she was, in fact, Sarah Denton. She stated that she was Martha Wickham and that there had been a horrible miscommunication. Reynolds was led to the cell where the woman was being held. What he witnessed left him greatly disturbed, but not in the way he expected. The woman was around the right age, dressed sober attire similar to Sarah's description, and there was a piercing quality in her eyes that matched the descriptions. However, something wasn't right. Her voice was different from what witnesses had stated. Her face had features that didn't quite match, and there was a visible scar on her left hand that no earlier description of Sarah revealed. Reynolds spent 3 days. Asked the woman a lot of questions. She consistently stuck to her narrative. Her name was Martha Wickham, the widow of a Mississippi farmer, and she was trying to recover property documents she felt had been stolen from her family during the tumult of the war. She fiercely denied any involvement in disappearances or itinerant missionary activities, although she acknowledged utilizing dubious techniques to try to access the county data. She had never traveled to North Carolina, had never named herself Sarah Denton, and could supply witnesses who had known her as Martha Wickham for years. Briggs had wired to Mississippi to verify her claim, and the replies confirmed the existence of a Martha Wickham who suited the description. There were records of her marriage, her husband's death in the war, and court conflicts over property that confirmed her narrative for being in the Lawrence Registry Office. Reynolds was forced to confront the prospect that he had detained the incorrect person, or worse, that Sarah Denton had manufactured. Fake identities that were so convincing they couldn't be distinguished from actual individuals. Martha Wickham was freed following a grueling week of investigation because there was insufficient evidence to keep her in custody. Reynolds stared helplessly as she left in a stagecoach, leaving only confusion and doubt in her wake. He would never know for sure if he had actually discovered Sarah Denton, and she had escaped through a meticulously designed phony name, or whether he had legitimately confronted an innocent woman whose shallow likeness to the sought felon had prompted a terrible misunderstanding. This episode exposed a troubling aspect of the inquiry. Sarah Denton had operated in the shadows for so long that it had become practically difficult to identify her with confidence. There were no images of her, no credible government documents, only verbal statements from people who had seen her briefly under highly charged conditions. She might be anywhere using any name, and no one would be able to definitively, until it was too late, recognize her. Sightings and reports from all across the South continued to come in during the next winter, but none resulted in encounters or captures. Sarah, assuming it was truly her in each case, had grown very cautious. The disappearance patterns continued, but now were more scattered and less noticeable, as if she had learned to space out her operations to avoid raising instant alarms. In January 1867, Blackwood released a second pamphlet, this time focusing not on characterizing Sarah physically, but on describing how she operates. He stated that trying to identify her by appearance was pointless, but understanding the pattern of behavior may save lives. The leaflet outlined the warning indications: an wandering missionary with no established church connection, a specific interest in isolated and vulnerable persons, progressively longer and more intensive praying sessions, encouragement of social solitude, introduction of concepts of transcendence through suffering and ego dissolution. Blackwood's work began to have an effect. Communities became more watchful after receiving and reading her brochures. Several women acting as Sarah were questioned, and some were removed from villages before they could acquire the trust necessary for her strategy to function. It was unknown how many of these ladies were genuinely Sarah in various guises, how many were impersonators duplicating her tactics, and how many were simply legitimate missionaries unlucky enough to somewhat fit the criteria outlined. During this time, a different theory concerning the fate of Sarah's victims emerged, proposed by a private investigator hired by the family of one of the missing persons. This detective, named Franklin Moore, had spent months touring the Smoky Mountains with skilled guides, searching for other caverns and quiet areas where remains might have been hidden. No fresh human remains were discovered by him. But he did discover something equally alarming. Moore uncovered evidence of a network of secret roads connecting different caverns around the mountains, paths known only to a very handful who had been investigating the area for decades. He believed that Sarah may have utilized these ways to transfer her victims to exceedingly isolated regions, perhaps even beyond state boundaries, where she held them in protracted captivity during psychological manipulation. When they finally died, whether from malnutrition, exposure to the elements, or more direct ways, their bodies might be discarded in deep ravines, mountain rivers, or cave chambers so inaccessible they would never be discovered. This idea would explain the entire disappearance of bodies, and also the period of time during which the victims were under Sarah's spell before finally disappearing. She didn't kill them immediately, but kept them alive and under her control for weeks or even months. Perhaps exploiting them for physical labor, companionship, or simply as subjects to satisfy some deep and twisted psychological need to exert absolute authority over other human beings. Sheriff Reynolds, albeit fatigued and growing disillusioned, pondering the potential of capturing Sarah, continued his compulsive hunt. He had become a tragic character, captivated with a case that looked unsolvable. His health was clearly failing. His family pleaded with him to let up and allow others handle the probe, as he had aged 10 years in a matter of years. Reynolds, however, was unable to leave the victims behind. He felt a personal responsibility for each missing person, as if each failure to safeguard them were a stain on his own soul. In the spring of 1867, Reynolds received an anonymous letter claiming to have definitive information on the whereabouts of Sarah Denton. According to the letter, she was working in a remote religious community in eastern Tennessee, close to the Virginia border, under the name Sister Grace. The community was defined as a group of individuals who, following the war, had distanced themselves from society in an effort to live by rigid and unusual interpretations of the Bible. Reynolds traveled to the indicated location, an arduous journey that took nearly a week through difficult mountainous terrain. When he eventually arrived at the community, he discovered that roughly 20 people were living in modest huts, farming enough to make ends meet, and spending the majority of their time in prayer and religious study. A woman, going by the name of Sister Grace, led them. But when Reynolds confronted her, she was clearly too young to be Sarah Denton, no older than 30. Sister Grace explained that the community had been founded by her and her late husband after they both experienced spiritual visions during the war. She gave Reynolds permission to conduct a thorough inspection of the neighborhood and denied knowing any Sarah Dentons. He discovered nothing strange, no indication of Sarah's usual deceptive tactics, and no proof that anyone was being detained there against their will. It was merely a collection of people who had selected an uncommon but presumably sincere and non-coercive religious path. Another false lead was the anonymous letter, which might have been sent by someone who harbored personal animosity toward the Sister Grace community and trying to exploit Reynolds to make trouble. Or perhaps it was Sarah's own handiwork, relishing in sending investigators in the wrong directions, displaying her power over the situation, even while staying invisible. Reynolds was even more frustrated and desperate after the encounter, even though he would never know the truth. Meanwhile, Blackwood continued his historical inquiry, aiming to piece together a complete picture of Sarah's past. He discovered proof that she might have been. Sarah inherited small properties and was involved in at least 2 other dubious marriages before to Josiah Blackwell, both of which resulted in the deaths of their husbands. The records were fragmentary and difficult to verify, distributed across numerous states with varied documentation systems, but the pattern was apparent. Sarah Denton, or whatever her real name was, had spent decades practicing her evil art. She had begun with relatively easy acts of poisoning for material gain, moved to more complicated, psychological tricks, and ultimately created a comprehensive mind control system that made victims voluntarily contribute to their own demise. She was, in Blackwood's words, an evolving predator, continuously modifying her ways to exploit new possibilities and escape detection. The following years witnessed a gradual shift in the nature of the Sarah Denton probe. The case, which had captivated so many people's interest during the immediate post-war period, began to chill as new. Priorities arose in the rebuilding nation. Sheriff Reynolds died in August 1868 at the age of 52 of a heart attack that many attributed to the stress and exertion of his compulsive hunt. He died without ever capturing Sarah, a fact that his final diaries indicated plagued him till his final moments. Blackwood continued his work more solitarily, turning his investigation into a personal crusade that would endure decades. He corresponded with dozens of local officials across the southern and western United States, collecting reports of unusual disappearances and trying to uncover trends that would suggest Sarah's presence. His paperwork swelled to take an entire room in his home, the walls covered with maps marked with colorful pins indicating possible sightings, verified disappearances, and localities that had reported the activity of suspected itinerant missionaries. Blackwood found at least 47 missing persons instances that fit Sarah's pattern of behavior between 1868 and 1872. They were spread across 11 distinct states from the original North Carolina to Texas in the west and Missouri in the north. Geographical dispersion made it hard for any single authority to coordinate efficient investigations, and the American judicial system of the time simply lacked the instruments to address crimes that crossed numerous jurisdictions in this fashion. But in 1873, something extraordinary happened. At Blackwood's Asheville office, a woman identified herself as Emily Warren. She was malnourished to the point of malnutrition, with eyes that held the kind of deep trauma Blackwood had learned to detect in war veterans. Emily claimed to have been a victim of Sarah Denton and had fled, the only person he knew who had survived the complete event and was willing to relate her story. Emily Warren was 39 when she met Sarah in 1870 in a small Arkansas village where she lived alone after the death of her husband and older son in a wagon accident that overturned on a bridge. She was horrified, thinking ways to terminate her own. Suffering when Sarah appeared, bringing spiritual solace. What followed was an 18-month period that Emily characterized as a steady decline into a psychiatric hell from which she barely emerged with her life and sanity. Blackwood received the most thorough explanation of Sarah's techniques from Emily. She explained how Sarah started off with sincere compassion and emotional support, developing complete trust over weeks of in-depth discussions during which she showed a great comprehension of Emily's suffering. Gradually, Sarah taught concepts such as how suffering was a choice, how personal identity was a prison, and how ultimate release needed the entire eradication of the ego that kept one locked in unpleasant reality. The prayer sessions got increasingly protracted and physically tiring. Sarah instituted days-long fasts, arguing that in order for the soul to transcend, the body had to be weakened. She kept Emily awake for extended periods of time by repeating phrases and ideas hypnotically while chanting mantras about transcendence and change. Emily talked about experiencing altered states of consciousness in which she lost her sense of reality. The distinction between wakefulness and sleep vanished, and she started to sincerely think that Sarah possessed extraordinary spiritual abilities. After months of this process, Sarah drove Emily to a remote place in the Arkansas mountains, an abandoned cottage far from society. The process became much more intense there. Emily was kept in almost complete seclusion, seeing just Sarah, eating only when Sarah allowed, sleeping only when she was given permission. She lost all concept of time, unsure if days or weeks had gone. Sarah performed intricate ceremonies incorporating the symbols that had been uncovered in the North Carolina caves years previously. Emily sobbed as she recounted that Sarah's declaration that she was prepared for the last change was the turning point. Sarah explained a method that would include Emily entering a kind of perpetual trance through a combination of high sensory, deprivation, and the consumption of drugs that Sarah prepared. Emily would be brought to a particular area where her physical body would cease to exist, but her spiritual essence would endure on a higher dimension of reality. Sarah spoke about this with such full confidence that Emily, in her fragmented state of mind, was prepared to embrace it. However, the night before the last ceremony, something unexpected occurred. In a vivid dream, Emily's departed son visited and told her that she had to live and that death would not. Honor him. It would be a betrayal of what they had shared. With a startling awakening, Emily realized that she was going to let Sarah kill her. In a moment of frantic lucidity, she recognized that Sarah was not delivering spiritual transcendence, but simply death through ways that concealed the reality of what was happening. That same night, when Sarah slept, Emily escaped the cabin. She rushed aimlessly through the dark woods, falling over roots and rocks, hurting her skin on branches and thorns. She had no idea where she was or where she was heading, only that she needed to get as far away as possible before Sarah woke and brought her back. By remarkable chance, she noticed a hunter's trail at daybreak and followed it until she reached a secluded farm where a family took her in and finally helped her return to civilization. Emily needed almost 3 years to fully recover from the trauma before she could approach Blackwood and share her tale. She continued to struggle with intrusive thoughts about Sarah's ideas and had nightmares every night, had taken root in her thoughts. However, she was committed to assisting in Sarah's capture so that others wouldn't have to endure the same tragedy. She was prepared to provide testimony in court, personally identify Sarah, and go to any lengths to ensure justice. Blackwood was greatly moved and energized by Emily's testimony. For the first time, there was a living witness who could provide direct evidence of Sarah's misdeeds. He immediately began working with Arkansas officials to identify the cabin where Emily had been detained, hoping it may contain physical evidence. He also began the process of obtaining Emily to give formal statements that may be used to enhance the legal allegations against Sarah. For months, search teams combed the Arkansas mountains seeking to locate the cabin Emily described. She went on multiple outings with them, attempting to identify locations that may direct their search. However, it was challenging to distinguish between true recollections and warped ones because of the trauma and changed mental state she had experienced during that time. Impressions. She could not pinpoint the precise path, but she could recall specific trees, rock formations, and the sound of a nearby creek. Finally, in October of 1873, they spotted a cabin that matched Emily's description. It was considerably more deteriorated than she remembered, with the roof partially fallen and the walls covered with moss and plants. But inside, shielded from deterioration by the dry atmosphere, they found the remains of candles grouped in circular patterns, symbols painted on the wooden walls, and, most alarmingly, many pieces of clothes that Emily identified as having belonging to her. They also found something no one expected: a second notebook of Sarah, similar to the one discovered years ago near the North Carolina caverns. More recent entries from 1868 to 1872 were included in this one. The documents revealed that Emily had not been Sarah's sole victim during those years in Arkansas. There were references to at least 5 more victims, all described as going through the same phases of preparation and manipulation for the ultimate change. However, it appears that the other 5 had not managed to get away, in contrast to Emily's situation. The last entries regarding each ended with the phrase "completed," the voyage followed by symbols Sarah seems to employ to indicate the successful conclusion of her procedure. There were no particular specifics about what happened during this final journey, but the implications were terrifying to contemplate. The notebook also contained Sarah's personal reflections that offered an insight into her mind. She wrote about feeling chosen for a noble mission to rescue souls enslaved by the illusion of earthly existence. She talked of a horrific experience from her own childhood, but it was never made plain what had made her realize that physical reality is illusion. By guiding people through death to what she considered to be a better form of existence, she truly felt, or at least had persuaded herself, that she was doing a spiritual duty. Blackwood pored over the journal, trying to extract any information that would help anticipate Sarah's future moves or comprehend her motivations. He came to the conclusion that, although Sarah Denton undoubtedly profited monetarily from her victims' estates, she was more than just a cunning criminal operating for material gain. She was something more intricate and dangerous. She was a devout follower of a perverted ideology she had created to explain and rationalize her heinous deeds. This explained why she had able to operate for so long without being apprehended. She wasn't pretending religious commitment to influence people. She genuinely saw herself as a spiritual figure with a divine mission. This utter conviction was what made her manipulation so powerful, because she actually believed what she was saying and was able to hypnotically communicate that faith to vulnerable people frantically seeking meaning and respite from their pain. The discovery of the second notebook and Emily Warren's testimony injected new energy into the investigation, but also exposed a frightening truth. Sarah Denton was growing bolder and more polished in her approaches. The years from 1874 to 1878 saw a succession of sightings and occurrences suggesting she had expanded her operations into further, more isolated territory, capitalizing on the expansion into the American West and the disarray that accompanied the foundation of new communities in newly acquired lands. Blackwood received reports of mysterious disappearances in Dakota Territory, Kansas, and even as far away as Wyoming Territory. The patterns were recognizable but adapted to the new contexts. Sarah, or women operating with same methods, occurred in mining camps, small frontier towns, and isolated farming areas. She took advantage of the fact that these communities were transient and poorly documented, where people appeared and disappeared regularly without attracting much official attention. In 1875, Blackwood became aware of a particularly troubling instance that originated in the town of Deadwood in Dakota Territory. 4 miners went missing during a 6-month period, according to a marshal named Seth Bullock. All last spotted in the company of a missionary who was holding services in a tent on the outskirts of town. The miners were solitary individuals who had had moderate success locating gold, but had no family or close contacts who could promptly report their departure. When stories of the disappearances started to spread, Bullock looked into it and found that the missionary had left suddenly. She left behind only her empty tent and There weren't many written religious tracts with the same theological fallacies seen in Sarah's writings. More distressing, Bullock traced the mining leases of the 4 missing men and discovered that they had all been changed to a fictitious name using documentation that later turned out to be bogus. Someone had sold these leases and pocketed the money before the crime was detected. This case illustrated an advancement in Sarah's method. She was no longer satisfied with the meager savings and possessions of remote farmers and widows. She had uncovered a new sort of rich victim, men who had found gold or built valuable concessions but lived alone without strong family ties. The frontier zone was suitable for her operations because the law was irregularly enforced. Records were poorly kept, and the high mortality from sickness, accidents, and violence meant that disappearances were not examined as closely. Blackwood personally journeyed to Deadwood in 1876, a difficult expedition that took weeks, through still perilous region. Even though his health was deteriorating at the age of 63, his resolve never wavered. He collaborated with Bullock in Deadwood to locate witnesses and collect evidence. What they discovered demonstrated how Sarah modified her methods to fit the frontier setting. Rather than spending months establishing individual relationships like she did in remote eastern areas, Sarah had hastened her work on the frontier. She found possible victims and made the first contact using her. Religious ceremonies, and then worked fast to isolate them with the promise of rigorous spiritual mentoring away from the temptations and distractions of the metropolis. The miners, many of whom held guilt over abandoning family back east or over questionable conduct in pursuit of fortune, were particularly vulnerable to her messages of salvation via pain and purification. Bullock had identified an abandoned property approximately 20 miles from Deadwood, where witnesses reported seeing the missionary leading men on. Spiritual retreats. Blackwood and Bullock, joined by a party of 6 deputies, rode to the scene on a cool September morning. What they discovered was strikingly comparable to earlier findings made in the Arkansas and North Carolina mountains. The property had been unoccupied for months, yet signs of recent occupation was clear. The main building had a number of little rooms, each with a narrow cot and no windows, which was ideal for Sarah's method of sensory isolation. The walls were coated in the recognizable symbols, now regarded as characteristics of her operations. In the barn, they found an underground chamber that had been constructed and reinforced, a confined, dark space where victims were likely kept during the most intensive stages of the manipulation. More alarmingly, they found a small, unmarked graveyard behind the barn. 5 shallow burials included human remains in varied degrees of decay. The remains had been buried without special care, simply dropped in holes and covered with earth. Preliminary examinations revealed no clear symptoms of violent trauma, no shattered bones or scars from equipment. The fatalities looked to have occurred through ways that left no skeletal evidence, probably malnutrition, dehydration, exposure, or poisoning with compounds that do not alter bones. The finding of the graves finally offered tangible physical evidence of Sarah's misdeeds. For the first time, bodies could be inspected, albeit under settings that made it difficult to pinpoint the reasons of death. Bullock started the procedure of attempting to identify the bodies by comparing descriptions of the missing miners with personal items discovered in the graves. 3 of the 5 bodies were later recognized as belonging to individuals who had been reported missing after attending the missionary services. Blackwood spent weeks in Deadwood, methodically documenting everything. He was constructing a case that he believed would eventually be compelling enough to summon substantial government resources in order to apprehend Sarah. With several states and regions implicated, overlapping jurisdictions, and now tangible proof of homicide, he contended that the federal government had not only the right, but the need to consider Sarah Denton as a national threat necessitating federal collaboration. Eventually, their appeals made their way to Washington authorities, and in 1877, federal funds were formally committed to the search for Sarah Denton for the first time. A small crew of federal investigators was tasked to collaborate with local authorities across numerous states and territories. It was a huge move, but it came too late for many victims, and still faced the practical restrictions of trying to hunt down a woman who had showed an exceptional ability to change identities and disappear at vital periods. Federal investigators followed several leads throughout the West in 1878. There were reports of a suspected missionary working among Mormon communities in Utah Territory, as well as possible sightings in Denver and Salt Lake City. Every lead was probed, but Sarah, if it was actually her, was always several steps ahead. It was like chasing a ghost that left havoc in its wake, but never lingered there long enough to be apprehended. Reverend Thornton, now an elderly man in his 70s, authored a series of theological writings during this period, striving to comprehend how the Christian faith could be so severely corrupted by someone like Sarah Denton. He believed that she represented a particularly dangerous sort of heresy, not a rejection of the faith, but its transformation into something horrible that kept the vocabulary and outward symbols of religion while radically twisting its meaning and purpose. His works were shared around churches and seminaries, alerting religious authorities to the perils of permitting unlicensed and unmonitored preachers to work in their communities. Emily Warren, who had emerged as a prominent witness in the case, accompanied Blackwood on multiple trips, providing local authorities with her account and assisting with training individuals to spot the red flags of Sarah's deceptive tactics. It was incredibly upsetting for Emily to relive her ordeal over and over again, but she thought it was her job to utilize her sorrow to protect others from facing the same misery. She became an outspoken and passionate advocate, someone whose survival carried a purpose that kept her battling her own inner demons. However, in spite of all the initiatives, more funding, and rising public awareness, Sarah Denton continued. Elusive, suspicious disappearances and sightings continued, but no one was apprehended. It was as if she had become part of the very fabric of the booming American West, a shadow sweeping around the margins of civilization, feasting on the lost and weak that the edges of society inevitably create in abundance. Blackwood was greatly troubled by an anonymous letter he received in December of 1878. The letter was written in a handwriting he recognized from Sarah's notebooks. It was brief and enigmatic. "I am offering you a gift that you will never comprehend. I shall continue my efforts until every imprisoned spirit is liberated. Because they are aware of the reality of what I do, the shadows shield me." There was no signature, simply the usual symbols scribbled around the margins of the paper. The letter indicates that Sarah was aware of the investigation, possibly even following it through media and official communications. She was sending a message. Because she thought she was protected by God, or perhaps because she had gotten so good at escaping detection that she regarded the investigators incapable of posing a real threat. It was a defiant and haughty attitude that exposed a mind considerably more troubled than anyone could have predicted. The Sarah Denton case came to an unexpected and extremely disappointing end in the last years of the 1870s. In March 1880, attorney Herbert Blackwood died at the age of 67, a victim of pneumonia, compounded by decades of exhausting travel and exposure to harsh weather during his investigations. He died in his home in Asheville, surrounded by heaps of paperwork and maps representing almost 15 years of compulsive work. Blackwood's death was a terrible blow to the organized investigation. His daughter, who took care of him, recorded his final words. "She's still out there." He had been the central force keeping multiple authorities connected and focused on the case. Without his unrelenting effort and the personal resources he invested in the quest, the investigative momentum swiftly dissipated. Federal investigators were transferred to other priorities, and local authorities reverted to dealing with more urgent and tangible crimes in their respective areas. Emily Warren continued to campaign for awareness of the risks of manipulators like Sarah. However, her reach was constrained by her lack of resources and Blackwood's lack of support. She wrote to a number of religious groups, alerting them to the warning signals of spiritual manipulation and urging them to exercise caution. She never knew the precise number of lives she saved since, unlike actual catastrophes, avoided tragedies are rarely recorded. During the 1880s, sightings of Sarah Denton were increasingly rare and less verifiable. There were sporadic reports of suspicious missionaries in outlying countries, but verifying whether any of them were genuinely Sarah became impossible. By that decade, she would have been in her 60s, although she might have easily changed her look or just withdrawn to some remote area where she continued to operate on a smaller scale away from the gaze of any authorities. Sarah Denton's ultimate fate has never been determined with certainty. There is no record of her capture, trial, or death. Over the course of her 3 decades of activities, she simply disappeared into the mists of history, leaving only the wreckage of dozens, if not hundreds, of lives. Official records conservatively estimate at least 60 verified or very probable victims, although the true number may be substantially higher, lost in the unfinished records of westward migration in the Civil War era. The Smoky Mountains caverns where Sarah practiced her macabre rites were eventually blocked by local officials, deemed too risky for casual explorers. The Dakota Ranch was burned to the ground by local vigilantes who believed the place was cursed. Sarah's diaries were held in criminal archives where they were forgotten for decades, until they were unearthed by historians in the 20th century, exposing to modern academics the entire extent of her operations and the disturbing sophistication of her methods of psychological manipulation. The case of Sarah Denton serves as a sobering reminder that the most dangerous predators don't usually resort to overt violence. Some destroy with whispered whispers empty promises of transcendence and the intentional exploitation of human fragility at its most frail. She operated in an era where restricted communication methods and divided authorities produced shadows, where creatures could thrive unnoticed, but even now, the psychological techniques she used are harmful and yet applicable. The Appalachian Mountains still hold their secrets. Hikers occasionally report finding weird symbols etched in distant caverns, abandoned cabins with inexplicable carvings on the walls. These are only echoes of a past that most people would prefer to forget, but they must be kept in mind as a warning of what happens when we let vulnerable individuals fall into the hands of those who view other people's pain not as a tragedy to be lessened, but as a potential for exploitation. Sarah Denton, the Appalachian Missionary who was too nasty for the history books, vanished physically but left a lasting mark on American knowledge of the risks of religious and psychological manipulation. Her narrative, repressed for decades because it was thought too distressing for proper public discussion, ultimately emerged from the dusty archives as testimony to one of the most intricate and horrifying criminal cases of the 19th century. If you've made it this far on this dark journey. For more tales that were overlooked or purposefully removed from official records, subscribe to the channel and explore the misty mountains and hidden mysteries of American history. Leave a comment offering your thoughts on this disturbing case. And if you know of additional tragic stories that deserve to be told, please mention them in the comments. Until the next inquiry, when we will continue to uncover the darkest and most unsettling secrets that the past attempted to conceal.